Untitled Chapter Podcast, episode 14.
Welcome to the Out of Order Podcast, your window into the firearms community, exploring those shaping the future of our rights and protecting our lifestyle, laws, legal cases, activism, and self-defense in a candid and honest podcast for our brothers and sisters in arms. Here's your host, James Kalita.
Welcome back to the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Today's sponsors are Liberty Classroom, where you get the history and economics they didn't teach you in high school. Today's guest is Belle McCormack. Belle is a mother, survivor, and firearms trainer at the Firearms Academy of Seattle. So head over to the show notes page for links to FAS and to our sponsors. And now, here's Belle.
Belle McCormack, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, James.
Oh, my pleasure. So, Belle, you work for the Firearms Academy of Seattle. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
I work for Marty Hayes. He started the Firearms Academy back in the, late 80s and bought the range that he currently runs his training program on in the early 90s. And it's a pretty extensive facility. We train civilians in the judicious use of deadly force, as well as basic use of firearms, handgun, rifle, shotgun. And I'm a staff instructor here. I teach primarily handgun curriculum, including the handgun retention program. But I'm also the student coordinator, which means I do all of the behind-the-scenes office stuff. I also work for his other business, the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network.
Oh, okay. Very good. I'm familiar with that one. Sorry, go ahead.
That's good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Cool. Right, so, and you mentioned the handgun retention program. I had not heard of that. Is that like close quarters, don't let somebody take your gun away program?
It focuses on not just retention in the holster techniques, but retention techniques involving if you've already drawn your firearm, and also disarms for if someone has drawn on you. And I personally believe that it is one of the most important classes that we teach here. Everybody focuses quite a bit on square range techniques and even, tactics and awareness and legalities somewhat, depending on where you go. But if you don't have some empty hand skills to go along with all that, you're lacking a little bit in what goes in your toolbox. And I'm a little proud of being able to teach that class because I'm the only female that has ever been certified to teach it.
Oh, okay. What's the origins of the course? Is it a Krav Maga course or?
It's based on the Lindell techniques that Mass originally started teaching when he began his training offerings. He's been through a few different names over the years. It was LFI at one point, and now it's the Masada Ayub group. But he was one of the people to originally start teaching those techniques, and Marty adopted a combination of his system and the Lindell system. And we think it works pretty well.
Oh, great. Yeah, it is impressive that you're the only female certified to teach it. And it's called the handgun retention system?
Yeah, it's a one-day class. We offer a free retake. We also do an advanced program. We do it generally in the spring and the fall. That's when it's a little harder to fill range classes. Nobody wants to be out here in the snow and the rain. So. Oh,
okay. I was racking my brain. I'm like, okay, the fall, maybe it's deer season, but I couldn't place spring. So, okay. All right.
Inclement weather.
Inclement weather. All right. Oh, great. So, Belle, how did you find your way into this line of work?
I was what Marty calls a motivated student. I am a domestic violence survivor, and I fled with my 3 children in 2013 from the North Idaho area back to where I grew up in Western Washington. And I knew that my abusive husband was hot on my heels and decided that I needed to learn how to protect myself. And I started out just getting my concealed carry permit and studying and reading everything that I could. I found an amazing teacher who helped me get introduced to the art of Krav Maga. And I spent a couple years doing that. But amidst that journey, I started bothering my local gunsmith, and he said maybe I should try getting some training. And at the time, I didn't even realize that that was something that was offered in my area. And he directed me to the Firearms Academy, and I quickly worked my way through their handgun curriculum and was just Johnny on the spot for the boss as much as I could, and eventually was invited into the apprenticeship program. There's a lot of different types of instructors out there. A lot of people want to see some extra form of credibility, whether it's ex-law enforcement, military, those sorts of things. But there's another category that I feel is pretty valid, and there's some other people in the industry that have a similar background, and that's those of us who have actually experienced and been victims of extreme violence and are coming from a position of experience that is what motivates a lot of our students to come in the first place.
I'm sure, and that really is a valuable piece of experience. You always, as someone who hasn't, experienced extreme violence, you always wonder how you're going to react when it happens, and to be able to learn from someone that had to deal with that, that's really valuable.
Well, and that is the hard part is not knowing how you would react, and what those of us who have been in those experiences discover a lot of times is it's not how we had hoped we would. Our brains are kind of like a computer, and if you haven't spent the time thinking about how you would deal with something, when you're faced with that situation that you hadn't put any thought into, sometimes the computer comes back with no file found. And that generates a freeze. They talk about fight or flight. Well, there's also freeze.
Right.
It pretty much happens to everyone, and the more experienced someone is, the shorter that time period is. But if you're dealing with something you've never experienced, that freeze can be pretty extensive, and that time generally equals damage. And once you've gone through that, you start thinking about how you would deal with stuff a little bit more seriously, and in hopes that you can eliminate that freeze time should you ever face it again.
Yeah. So were you always a pro-gun person, even prior to this becoming an instructor?
My dad was a hunter and an outdoor enthusiast, and we spent lots of time when I was a kid going out to the gravel pit and shooting rifles. I had actually never shot a handgun other than a .22 revolver until 2013, when a friend of mine took me out to the range and had me try a couple of different handguns. And the first thing I said to him after we were done is, "How many more are there, and can I try them all?"
Yeah, it's interesting when I talk to people who volunteer to teach first-time shooters. They always talk about that as being the best way to sort of move people from the anti-gun side to the pro-gun side. And everyone I talk to that started shooting late in life kind of describes that same feeling, that that desire to keep shooting after they tried it. So yeah, that is great. So when you first started realizing that you needed to train, that you might have to use deadly force, what goes through your mind when you're in that situation?
Well, a lot of it is making some decisions about self-worth. One of the hardest things to get across to women is that that permission to do damage to another human being if it's necessary. And a lot of times, especially with mothers, it takes putting in their head the idea of having to protect their children to get them to bring out that level of aggression necessary. You have to give yourself permission. You have to take the time to go through that thought process of, is my life worth more than someone who would do me harm? And the answer is yes. Yes, absolutely it is. And you have to think about your goals. I trained with someone very recently whose philosophy really resonated with me, and it was, I want to go home. And I don't care what I have to do to get there. If someone wants to hurt me, my goal is to go home. And that really broke it down for me in a sense that I was able to understand and be okay with. We all have moral codes and moral lines that kind of dictate our behavior and what we will or won't do. And the way I look at it is, I have 3 kids at home that depend on me, and how much self-worth I'm willing to put on myself really doesn't matter. I am the world to them. And if I have to do something ugly to get home to them, it's worth it. My life is worth a lot because I have 3 people who depend on me.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very good mindset to have. So for, I guess, someone that's where you were in 2012, 2013, what advice would you give them?
That's a tough one. Because as I've gone through my journey of empowerment, as Marty would refer to it, I've noticed a lot of things that kept me where I was. And, that's one of the questions that a lot of people ask women is, why did you stay? And there's so many reasons, and just the idea of having to start your life over again with no skills, no job history, no understanding of how to take care of your own bills or run your own finances, or all of those things that a lot of us, when we end up in a situation like that, give up. It can be a really daunting task to think about how you're going to take care of all those things, or who you're going to rely on to help you. And as far as the advice that I would give someone else in my same position, it's just to reach out and ask advice, because every situation is different and the obstacles are different for everyone, and none of it can really be done without any help. And there's all sorts of resources out there. I was very fortunate that there was a domestic violence advocacy center in my area. And I just called them and asked them what they could do. And it started out with a court advocate and getting protection orders, and then it moved on from there. But you have to ask. You have to ask. And even if you don't like what you hear, then you ask somebody else, but you don't stop asking for help, because nobody can do something like that all on their own.
Okay, and you mentioned the courts. Were they helpful? Were the restraining orders and the court system, did it help at all?
I knew that question was coming. Yes and no, eventually, because all of the original incidences happened in another state. The first answer I got when I sought out a protection order was he would have to come here and assault you, which he did. And then I approached the court again, and then they gave me a protection order. And it was worth about as much as the piece of paper it was written on. And it took a second assault that was more extreme. where he threw me out of the vehicle into oncoming traffic and drove away with my children. And then a few miles down the road was caught and arrested, and that was the last time they saw their biological father. But the court's answer to that incident was 20 days in jail and an $800 fine.
Wow. And I had heard you, talk about that on the Polite Society podcast, but I didn't realize that he had taken your children, and I guess that didn't count as kidnapping for some reason. But wow,
the family courts are very complicated and very difficult to navigate. Washington has a reputation for being very partial to mothers and very hard on the father. And I've seen cases that make me very sad where good men were denied rights that they should have been given. And then I see cases like mine where it really was a good thing that things were as biased as they were, because I would have had to have fought a lot harder, a lot longer, and my children would have been exposed to more violence before I would have been able to succeed. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Sure. So for people thinking of picking up firearms for the first time, any advice for them, maybe in particular women, if they're thinking about shooting for the first time or carrying a firearm for defense?
Well, it's a commitment. It's a huge commitment. And when I first started my commitment to everyday carry, it was uncomfortable and it was difficult and it was a giant pain. And most of the time I didn't want to go through the trouble, but I made the decision that I was going to do this and I was going to learn how to do it the best way possible. And that included some pretty extensive training. I think that, and this is an unpopular opinion, and I wasn't sure I was going to share it, but at some point I'm going to have to. I think that women should really make an effort to get over their desire to be segregated from men on the range and really give an honest effort to integrate themselves into normal range environments, which are going to include a majority of men. Because especially those of us that are coming from a background of domestic violence or violent encounters in general, generally that is going to have involved a male. And how are we going to learn what good men look like if we don't give ourselves an opportunity to interact with them? And if we segregate ourselves into women's only activities, then our opportunities are going to be limited. And not always, but sometimes the quality of the training is going to be affected. I see women in beginners classes a lot. I see them in advanced training rarely. And beginners classes are the equivalent of graduating kindergarten. You can't go out and make a living with that level of education. And you can't go out and be a competent concealed carry citizen without some more advanced training that at least includes, some of the legalities, more than square range training, some scenario training, some decision-making training, making those mistakes that anyone who's done scenario training knows you make mistakes. And I think we would all rather make them on a range with an airsoft pistol than out in real life. And women they've got to be willing to get on the range with the boys, because the advanced classes for just girls, they're not out there.
Yeah, I've spoken to a few women that said that as you progress, it's harder and harder to find advanced training. Do you think it's true that women are less likely to pursue advanced training, or is it just because I what I gather, I'm not part of any training group, but I gather that the attendance in advanced classes is always smaller than beginner classes. So do you think it's just do you think the attrition of women is greater than for men?
I'm not sure what the problem is, and it's something that I've asked my colleagues, especially other female instructors, what is it? What can we do? There's lots of really outstanding women trainers out there that try and make a very hospitable environment. Marty has more female instructors working for him than any other facility I'm aware of. And still the attendance is low. And here's the thing. Who is more likely to face violence in our society? Generally it's those who are less physically inclined and more suited as a victim to criminals. So you're looking at elderly, you're looking at disabled, you're looking at the young and females. Yeah. We are on the list of who is most likely to be chosen as a victim. Therefore, the logical conclusion is that we're the ones that need that training more. You or anyone else like you can go through training. You can carry yourself differently. You can have all those cues that'll make you ruled out as a victim. I can do all of those same things and still get targeted.
That's true. Yeah. So there's a myth out there, or that's cycled that that if women have a gun, they're more likely to have it used against them than be able to use it themselves. So you
just made the case for my handgun retention class.
Yeah. and that's what came to mind when you mentioned it before. I never, I forget if it was it Clint Smith that said make them advance through a hail of bullets, so if they kill you with their own gun, it has to be an empty one, But yeah, so if you encounter someone that that has that belief or that's been told that, what would you share with them?
Well, that a quality handgun retention would be in their best interest, and to identify a quality program, it needs to be one that's based on leverage, not strength. And there are certainly techniques out there, the system that we teach being one of them, where it relies on position of advantage and leverage, not physical strength. And I get plenty of big guys in the class that always want to test if the technique really works. And I have no problem going ahead and applying the technique at full force just so they know.
Sure, yeah. That's something my jiu-jitsu training friends always say, that if you want to get good, you have to train with a small person, because then you know that it's not muscle, that it's the technique.
I've spent a little bit of time on the mats in a jiu-jitsu dojo as well, and the concept is very similar. It's based on leverage and positioning, not strength, because those in our society that possess superior strength, they don't need those things as much. They're less likely to face a situation where they need to apply that. Those of us who are limited in our physical strength, we're more likely, so having those techniques in the toolbox makes all the difference. I find it frustrating to no end when I take rifle training and I'm the first to fatigue because of the weight of the rifle. And I don't exactly fall into the category of your usual frail female. I spend a lot of time strength training, and the difference it makes still is not enough.
Yeah, that's, I guess it is something that we take for granted, that men take for granted. But wow, the weight of the rifle. Yeah, I look, anytime I think of training with with the vest, I kind of shudder, almost like it was leg day, and but I could see that. So I've been asking all of my guests, and I keep forgetting to warn people beforehand, but are there any books that you would recommend that gun owners read that, whether it be about mindset or firearms or liberty or...
Yes, I have a couple actually. Roy Miller's Facing Violence is an outstanding read and really got me thinking. Andy Brown's book, Warnings Unheeded, a lot of people have the misconception that it's just a story about military, and it is not. The messages in his book apply to so many different facets of life. I cannot recommend his book enough. And one I would specifically recommend to either survivors of violence would be the author Anna Valdesari. She wrote a book called A Woman's Toolkit for Healing from Violence, and that's an excellent read. But she also wrote a book that appeals to, and I'm probably going to butcher the title, but it's something along the lines of trauma-aware instruction. And basically it's for those of us who work in the industry who inevitably are going to run into someone on our range or in our dojo that is like I was. And she gives you a lot of tips on how to empower those people and how to help them want to learn more. And any one of those three authors would be very good reads that I would highly recommend.
Great. I thank you, and I thank you very much for being on the show. Any last messages for our audience?
Well, just get out there and train. Value your life and the people that are in it, and don't take it for granted. Get out there and get your skill set up to par.
All right, great. And they should look for you online at Firearms Academy of Seattle, and any other pages or accounts I should share on the show notes page?
Well, you can always throw Polite Society in there. Please, by all means, throw the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network in there.
Okay.
We are special in the after self-defense programs. We're a members only, or a members benefits organization, not an insurance company, and
okay.
The educational materials alone are worth their weight.
Okay, very good. I will include those as well. All right. Well, I thank you again for being on the show, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate the invite.
Thanks again for listening to the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Please head over to the show notes page, outoforderjameskalita.com/Bell, and we'll see you next time.